Malcom X was a minister, civil rights activist, and prominent black nationalist leader who served as a spokesman for the Nation of Islam during the 1950s and 1960s. Due largely to his efforts, the Nation of Islam grew from a mere 400 members at the time he was released from prison in 1952 to 40,000 members by 1960. A naturally gifted orator, Malcom X exhorted black people to cast off the shackles of racism by any means necessary, including violence. The fiery civil rights leader broke with the Nation of Islam shortly before his assassination in 1965 at the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan, where he had been preparing to deliver a speech. He was 39 years old. Malcom X was born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska. He was the fourth of 8 children born to Louise, a homemaker, and Earl Little, a preacher who was also an active member of the local chapter of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and avid supporter of black nationalist leader Marcus Garvey. Due to Earl Little's civil rights activism, the family was subjected to frequent harassment from white supremacist groups including the Ku Klux Klan and one of its splinter factions, the Black Legion. In fact, Malcolm Little had his first encounter with racism before he was even born. When my mother was pregnant with me, she told me later, a party of hooded Ku Klux Klan riders galloped up to our home, Malcolm later remembered. Brandishing their shotguns and rifles, they shouted for my father to come out. The harassment continued when Malcolm was 4 years old, and local Klan members smashed all of the family's windows. To protect his family, Earl Little moved them from Omaha to Milwaukee in 1926 and then to Lansing, Michigan, in 1928. However, the racism the family encountered in Lansing proved even greater than in Omaha. Shortly after the Littles moved in, a racist mob set their house on fire in 1929, and the town's all-white emergency responders refused to do anything. The white police and firemen came and stood around watching as the house burned to the ground, Malcolm later remembered. Earl moved the family to East Lansing where he built a new home. 2 years later, in 1931, Earl's dead body was discovered lying across the municipal streetcar tracks. Although the family believed Earl was murdered by white supremacists from whom he had received frequent death threats, the police officially ruled his death a streetcar accident, thereby voiding the large life insurance policy he had purchased in order to provide for his family in the event of his death. Louise never recovered from the shock and grief over her husband's death. In 1937, she was committed to a mental institution where she remained for the next 26 years. Malcolm and his siblings were separated and placed in foster homes. In 1938, Malcolm was kicked out of West Junior High School and sent to a juvenile detention home in Mason, Michigan. The white couple who ran the home treated him well, but he wrote in his autobiography that he was treated more like a pink poodle or a pet canary than a human being. He attended Mason High School where he was one of only a few black students. He excelled academically and was well liked by his classmates, who elected him class president. A turning point in Malcolm's childhood came in 1939 when his English teacher asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, and he answered that he wanted to be a lawyer. His teacher responded, "One of life's first needs is for us to be realistic. You need to think of something you can be. Why don't you plan on carpentry?" Having been told in no uncertain terms that there was no point in a black child pursuing education, Malcolm dropped out of school the following year, at the age of 15. After quitting school, Malcolm moved to Boston to live with his older half-sister, Ella, about whom he later recalled, "She was the first really proud black woman I had ever seen in my life. She was plainly proud of her very dark skin." This was unheard of among Negroes in those days. Ella landed Malcolm a job shining shoes at the Roseland Ballroom. However, out on his own on the streets of Boston, he became acquainted with the city's criminal underground and soon turned to selling drugs. He got another job as kitchen help on the Yankee Clipper train between New York and Boston and fell further into a life of drugs and crime. Sporting flamboyant pinstriped zoot suits, he frequented nightclubs and dance halls and turned more fully to crime to finance his lavish lifestyle. Time in prison. In 1946, Malcolm was arrested on charges of larceny and sentenced to 10 years in prison. To pass the time during his incarceration, he read constantly, devouring books from the prison library in an attempt to make up for the years of education he had missed by dropping out of high school. Also while in prison, Malcolm was visited by several siblings who had joined the Nation of Islam, a small sect of black Muslims who embraced the ideology of black nationalism, the idea that in order to secure freedom, justice, and equality, black Americans needed to establish their own state entirely separate from white Americans. He changed his name to Malcom X and converted to the Nation of Islam before his release from prison in 1952 after 6.5 years. Now a free man, Malcom X traveled to Detroit, where he worked with the leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, to expand the movement's following among black Americans nationwide. Malcom X became the minister of Temple No. 7 in Harlem and Temple No. 11 in Boston, while also founding new temples in Hartford and Philadelphia. In 1960, he established a national newspaper called Muhammad Speaks in order to further promote the message of the Nation of Islam. Articulate, passionate, and an inspirational orator, Malcom X exhorted black people to cast off the shackles of racism by any means necessary, including violence. You don't have a peaceful revolution. You don't have a turn-the-cheek revolution, he said. There's no such thing as a nonviolent revolution. Timeline of Malcom X's life. In 1925. May 19, Malcom X is born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska, the fourth of Earl and Louise Little's 7 children. Earl, a Baptist minister, is a follower of Marcus Garvey's black nationalism and serves as Omaha chapter president of Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. Louise Little serves as the division secretary. In 1926 December, the Littles leave Omaha and move to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In 1928, the Littles move again, this time to Lansing, Michigan. Settling in a white neighborhood, they are sued for eviction on the basis that a restrictive covenant prevents their home from being sold to any non-Caucasians. November 7, the Little house is burned to the ground. No fire wagon is dispatched to the scene. Looking back, Malcolm believes that a local white supremacist group was behind it. December, Earl Little moves his family to East Lansing and builds a new home there. In 1931. September 28, Louise has a premonition about her husband and asks him not to leave the house. Later that night, Earl Little is killed in what police term a streetcar accident, but Malcolm later says that the Ku Klux Klan was behind it. After Earl's death, his wife and children struggle to make ends meet and must apply for public assistance. In 1938. December 23, Louise Little is diagnosed as mentally ill and sent to the Kalamazoo State Mental Hospital, where she will stay for 26 years. In 1939. The state places the Little children with various foster families, and Malcolm, who has been kicked out of school in the 7th grade, is sent to a juvenile home in the nearly all-white community of Mason, Michigan. He does well at school there, earning straight A's and being elected president of his 8th grade class, but his teacher discourages him about pursuing his goal of becoming a lawyer. In 1940. Summer, 15-year-old Malcolm visits his half-sister Ella Collins in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston and is entranced. I couldn't have feigned indifference if I had tried to, he later says. I didn't know the world contained as many Negroes as I saw thronging downtown Roxbury at night. In 1941. February, Ella Collins gains custody of Malcolm and he moves to Boston. Over the next few years, he works a number of odd jobs on railroads, in restaurants and bars, at shoeshine stands, and in a jewelry store. Malcolm learns to dress like a hipster, dyes his hair, and starts hustling in Boston, where he's known as New York Red, New York, where the nickname is Detroit Red, and Detroit. In 1943. October 25, Malcolm, who has responded to his draft notice by loudly proclaiming that he wants to fight for the Japanese and kill whites, is found mentally unfit for military service and classified 4F. In 1944, Malcom has his first run-in with the courts. He is sentenced to 4 months in jail and 1 year of probation for larceny. In 1945, December, Malcom, who has moved back to Boston, goes on a stealing spree with his black friend Malcolm Jarvis and 3 white women, one of whom he has been dating. In 1946, January, Malcom tries to retrieve a stolen $1,000 watch from a pawn shop and is arrested and charged with grand larceny, breaking and entering, and firearms possession. He is convicted and, along with Jarvis, receives an 8 to 10 year sentence. The white women have their sentences suspended, but Malcolm's girlfriend serves 7 months in prison. The women refused the police suggestion to charge Malcom and Malcolm Jarvis with rape. February, at the age of 20, Malcom is sent to jail in Charlestown, Massachusetts, and assigned prisoner number 22,843. He will remain behind bars until 1952. In 1947, Malcom is transferred to Concord Reformatory for 15 months. In 1948, Malcom is transferred to Norfolk Prison Colony in Massachusetts. In 1947, Malcom meets a fellow convict he calls Bimbi, who convinces Malcom to study and learn to develop his mind. In Jarvis' words, "In prison the only way we knew how to rebel was to cram some knowledge into our brains." In 1948, Malcom's siblings, 4 of whom have converted to Islam, introduce him to the words of the Nation of Islam's leader, Elijah Muhammad, who is himself in prison for sedition and violation of the draft laws. The 2 men correspond, and Malcom continues his course of study, eventually writing to the Massachusetts governor and demanding the right to practice Islam in prison. He also joins the prison debate team and begins attracting attention for his oratory. In 1951, Malcom is denied parole. In 1952, August 7, Malcom is released on parole, spends one night with Ella Collins, then goes to Detroit to live with his brother Wilfred. He quickly joins the Nation of Islam and attends meetings at Detroit's Temple No. 1, one of the 4 temples that the nation operates at the time. Malcom rejects the surname Little as a slave name given to his family by white oppressors, and he becomes known as Malcom X. Dismayed that the Nation of Islam is not attracting more followers, at the time, total nationwide membership was about 400, Malcom begins an intensive recruiting campaign with Elijah Muhammad's blessing. Soon membership in the nation begins to soar. In 1953, August, having tripled the membership of the Detroit Temple in under a year, Malcom is appointed assistant minister there. September, Elijah Muhammad sends Malcom back to Boston to serve as first minister of its Temple No. 11. He goes on to organize temples along the East Coast, including in Hartford and Philadelphia, attracting new members wherever he speaks. In 1954, June, Elijah Muhammad gives Malcom his highest appointment to date, Chief Minister of Harlem's Temple No. 7. In Malcom's words, "For Mr. Muhammad's teachings really to resurrect American black people, Islam obviously had to grow very big. And nowhere in America was such a single temple potential available as in New York's 5 boroughs." Thanks in large part to Malcom's charisma and tireless recruiting, within the next 5 years membership in the Nation of Islam swells to 40,000 and supports 49 temples. In 1955, Malcom X attends the first conference of the Non-Aligned Nations in Bandung, Indonesia. In 1956, Malcolm's future wife Betty Sanders becomes a member of the Harlem Temple and adopts the name Betty X. They will marry 2 years later, after Malcom proposes by phone from a Detroit gas station, and take up residence in East Elmhurst, Queens. In 1957, April 14, New York Temple member Johnson Hinton is savagely beaten by police. Alerted by other followers, Malcom joins a contingent of Muslims at the 28th Precinct headquarters in Harlem, where he demands that Hinton receive medical attention. Hinton is eventually taken by ambulance to a nearby hospital, but the Muslims refuse to disperse, which alarms police. Satisfied that his demands have been met, Malcom disperses the crowd with a wave of his hand. He later sues New York City for police brutality and wins the largest settlement in its history. Media coverage of the Hinton incident brings Malcom national attention, and the FBI, which has kept a file on Malcom since 1953, now considers him a key figure meriting significant surveillance. Police harassment of Malcom and his family escalates. In 1958, Malcom and Betty X's first child, Atala, is born. In 1959, spring-summer, Malcom makes his first trips abroad, visiting Ghana, Sudan, Nigeria, Iran, Syria, Egypt, and the United Arab Republic. Illness prevents him from traveling to Mecca. Meets with President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. July 13, New York Television begins airing a 5-part documentary by Mike Wallace entitled The Hate That Hate Produced, which Wallace calls a study of the rise of black racism, of a call for black supremacy among a small but growing segment of the American Negro population. Elijah Muhammad has been against participating in the program, but Malcom talks him into it. Despite its negative tone, the documentary spurs increased interest and growing membership in the Nation of Islam. In Malcom's words, "It seems that everywhere I went telephones were ringing." But the nation's higher profile alarms many in both the white community and the nascent civil rights movement. In 1960, Malcom establishes a newspaper Muhammad Speaks to promote the Nation of Islam's message. The nation becomes increasingly involved in a series of other successful business ventures, opening restaurants and grocery stores. Despite initial resistance from Malcom, who accuses him of being the white man's spy, black writer Alex Haley composes an article about the Nation of Islam entitled Mr. Muhammad Speaks for Reader's Digest, which both Malcom and Elijah Muhammad compliment. Haley later conducts an interview with Malcom for Playboy magazine, which to Malcom's surprise agrees to and then prints his answers verbatim. Malcom arranges for Fidel Castro and his entourage to stay at the Hotel Teresa after they are refused accommodation at a downtown hotel. In 1961, Elijah Muhammad, who has moved from Chicago to Phoenix for health reasons, makes Malcom national representative of the Nation of Islam. This creates resentment among Muhammad's inner circle who do not want Malcom to be the next leader. Malcom is increasingly asked to lecture on college campuses. Eventually he will trail only Barry Goldwater in popularity as a speaker there, and participate in television and radio debates. In 1962, April 27, an altercation leads to police entering the Los Angeles Temple and killing its unarmed secretary, Ronald Stokes. "They're going to pay for it," Malcom declares, and goes to Los Angeles to eulogize Stokes at a funeral attended by 2,000 people. He says the police shot innocent unarmed black men in cold blood and urges action. But Elijah Muhammad resists calls for an aggressive response. An all-white coroner's jury deliberates about Stokes' killing for 23 minutes and terms it justifiable homicide. By contrast, 14 Nation of Islam members are indicted for assault in the incident and 11 are found guilty. Later this year, Malcom confirms that Elijah Muhammad has engaged in repeated adultery and had children with at least 3 of his young secretaries. "I felt almost out of my mind," Malcom says. Herbert Muhammad asks Muhammad Speaks to minimize coverage of Malcom X. In 1963, Malcom begins work on his autobiography with Haley, making 2 or 3-hour visits to the writer's studio in Greenwich Village. Although, in Haley's words, "We got off to a very poor start," eventually Malcom warms to the project and begins to share the details of his life. April, Malcom flies to Phoenix with Elijah Muhammad's son Wallace to confront the Nation of Islam's leader. The 3 men agree that Muhammad's behavior will be defended by likening it to that of several Old Testament prophets. But when Malcom describes the idea to several other Nation of Islam ministers, he is accused of inflaming the situation. The next month Malcom writes a letter of apology to Muhammad, but relations between them continue to cool. August 28, Malcom observes the March on Washington, which he calls a farce. Malcom claims the demonstration was run by whites in front of a statue of a president who has been dead for 100 years and who didn't like us when he was alive. December 1, just a few days after President John F. Kennedy has been assassinated, Malcom speaks at a Nation of Islam rally in New York and, in response to a question, describes the foul play that the United States has committed around the world and states that Kennedy's slaying is a case of chickens coming home to roost. 3 days later, Elijah Muhammad, who had ordered Malcom not to comment on the assassination, responds by silencing him for 90 days, during which time Malcom is forbidden to teach or talk to the press. In 1964, January 6, Malcom goes to Phoenix to meet with Elijah Muhammad, who orders him to put out the fire you've started about the leader's adultery. Malcom is also removed as the nation's national representative and as minister of the Harlem Temple No. 7. January 15, Malcom and his family spend a week at boxer Cassius Clay's Miami compound. Clay, though not yet a Muslim, seeks guidance as he prepares for a fight against Sonny Liston. After this visit, tensions increase between Malcom and Elijah Muhammad. Cassius Clay becomes a member of the Nation of Islam and is renamed Muhammad Ali at the nation's annual convention. Malcom is not invited. March, suspended indefinitely by the Nation of Islam, Malcom announces plans to form his own organization called Muslim Mosque Incorporated. The Nation of Islam responds by requesting, via certified mail, that he surrender all its property, including Malcom's house in Queens. Malcom predicts that black Muslim leaders will murder him because I know where the bodies are buried. While in Washington to observe a Senate filibuster against the Civil Rights Bill, Malcom has a chance meeting with Martin Luther King Jr. and a photographer snaps the only picture ever taken of the two men together. April, Malcom delivers his famous election year ballot or the bullet speech, then leaves for a 5-week tour of Egypt, Lebanon, Liberia, Senegal, Nigeria, Ghana, and Saudi Arabia, where he makes a pilgrimage to Mecca and receives a new Islamic name, el-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, as well as expresses a somewhat different attitude about race. In Mecca, Malcom writes, he witnessed pilgrims of all colors from all parts of this earth displaying a spirit of unity and brotherhood like I've never seen before. While still determined to bring charges for mistreatment of African Americans against the United States in the United Nations, Malcom opines that studying Islam might cause white Americans to turn away from their racism. Summer-fall, although celebrated as a leader abroad, Malcom finds himself under increased attack at home. The Nation of Islam begins eviction proceedings against him, his brother Filbert denounces him, and his life is threatened. Malcom retaliates by making repeated public reference to Elijah Muhammad's adultery. Malcom also forms the Organization of Afro-American Unity, OAAU, reflecting a growing political agenda, and spends nearly 5 months in Africa visiting heads of state and lobbying for his UN plan. Winter, Malcom returns briefly to America, then flies to England to participate in a debate at Oxford University. He continues to speak at OAAU rallies and publicly supports the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Louise Little is finally released from the Michigan Mental Hospital. In 1965, January, Malcom flies to Los Angeles to meet with Gladys Towles Roots and 2 Nation of Islam secretaries who are filing paternity suits against Elijah Muhammad. February 4, Malcom speaks in Selma, Alabama, at the invitation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He flies to London the next day and is subsequently refused entry into France. February 13, Malcom returns from London. February 14, Malcom's home in East Elmhurst is firebombed. Malcom X says that it is upon the orders of Elijah Muhammad. His family is evicted 4 days later. In Alex Haley's words, what I was seeing was a man who was valiant beyond belief, whose structural world was tottering, and he was trying to hold it together. February 21, Malcom X is assassinated while speaking at an OAAU rally in Harlem. 3 members of the Nation of Islam are later convicted despite the fact that the assailant apprehended at the scene Talmadge Hayer insisted that his 2 co-defendants are innocent. February 27, Actor Ossie Davis leads the funeral service for Malcom X, 1,500 people attend. He is buried at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York. Later that year, the autobiography of Malcolm X is published, and Betty Shabazz, who was pregnant at the time of Malcolm's murder, gives birth to his last two daughters. Thank you for watching this video.